Yeah.
Welcome to our adult ed class here today as we begin a month of, well, it's a 3-week series on care for God's creation. We're very excited about that because personally, I believe that there are two things that all of us need to be working on: care for God's creation and care for God's most vulnerable people, the poorest in the world. And so this is why it's a favorite topic of mine and a favorite ministry. And we're so glad to have Dr. Lisa Dayhill here for today. And she'll be back with us in 2 weeks and do most of that hour in 2 weeks. And then at the end of that hour, we'll go out to the garden where Pastor Chamey will lead us in 2 weeks. And then next week, Pastor Chamey's with us for the whole hour in here talking about garden ministry. But today we have Dr. Lisa Dayhill, professor of religion at CLU, and her specialties, I would say, I'm not sure if they're in this order, but definitely care for God's creation. Edited this book, Echo Reformation, with James Martin Schramm from Luther College. And so, care for God's creation, Luther, Bonhoeffer, spirituality, prayer. Those are the main things that you
We're
teach.
teaching a class on the arts, spirituality and the arts in the fall.
Spirituality and the arts,
Yeah.
very good.
Yeah.
So whatever
Jack
more you want
Ledbetter
to
in it.
say, tell us your story too.
Yeah.
Her parents are here most every Sunday at the 9:30 service. Susanna and Richard Dayhill, and they're a delightful couple, and they come with Barbara Hearn, and often. So they are they're dear ones. Yeah, that's her parents. Let's see. So. Anything else? I wanted to announce that this was in the paper this morning, Earth Day events planned in Ventura County, so this morning's paper had that. I know we got a little blurb about it at our home, and it's talked about Saturday the 28th
At the library, Teal Library.
is more events for Thousand Oaks, I believe. Yeah. But
It came in
we'll,
the water bill.
yeah.
It was a little thing.
yeah, the water bill.
You know, they send out those announcements, I think
Yeah,
it
it
was
was
a water
good.
bill or
Yeah, that
something.
was good. So we'll share more information about that next week. So let's welcome Dr. Lisa Dayhill.
Yeah, thank you, Pastor Steve. And I'm happy to be here with all of you, and excited to be here in the Easter season in particular to look at this topic, which of course is so essential for our very lives. So it's a much bigger topic, of course. I tell my environmental ethics students, this class has no boundaries. This class extends in all directions, sort of biologically, because we're biologically interwoven with all that is, and the air we're breathing in is coming from the trees breathing it out, right? The literal means of our lives are biologically interwoven with all other creatures on Earth. The water we drink from the tap, it was snow in the Sierras, we know that intellectually, but we're not always in touch, right? And it has no edges spiritually, because Jesus, the incarnation, moves the life of God into the very heart and depth of materiality as well. So between the two of us, we'll touch on a few topics in this area in the next few weeks, but it's just a little teaser, really. So I thought about, so tell me if you think it's a good idea to bring a little bibliography or resources next time that people might want to, read more or have more material to dig into. So today I called this God's Creation and the Life of the World, and found most of the images are from a presentation I gave at the university where I teach, showing its sort of outdoor life, but I did find one of Ascension. Maybe you can tell which one is from Ascension up there. And it's very fitting for our 3 weeks as well, as we'll be moving into the garden. So I'm starting off with the need. So we're starting with the big, sort of depressing, scary piece of this whole topic. And we'll look a little bit at that, and then we're going to look mostly today at biblical passages that sort of ground a Christian Lutheran eco-spirituality. And then at the end, we'll look a little bit, depending on how much time we have, at sort of how then can we live? What does this mean? Luther's great question, right? What does this mean? So the need, right, this basic fact, the global economy runs on fossil fuels, which is great, right? Providing us all kinds of technology and convenience and medical advances and this, style and quality of life to which we have become accustomed and habituated, and yet the fossil fuels that run the global economy are also fueling climate change, and we're depleting Earth's resources on every level, every scale, every ecosystem, every means of life is being depleted at levels that are completely unsustainable. This whole thing is not sustainable. This way of doing university, that's a picture of CLU there, is not sustainable. This way of doing church is not sustainable. That means it will end. And it will end either gracefully, if we can make a great big change in how we do global economy and how we do what does it mean to be Christian, what does it mean to be me, and all that kind of stuff. Or it will end ungracefully, as it were, in a more wrenching, catastrophic kind of way in some number of years. But that's what it means to say that this is an unsustainable way of life. So we talk about questions like, what's your carbon footprint? And what's your water footprint? And maybe these are familiar concepts to all of you, or maybe they're not. So I see some heads nodding, some familiar. Yes, very good, there in the front row, or second row. So carbon footprint, how much carbon emission does your moving through your day, everything from literally burning gasoline to get to church, perhaps, if you drove to get here, to heating your home and all that kind of stuff, to things like the food you eat. How much carbon emission does it take to raise that food? And we can eat in ways that produce more or less carbon, gigantically more or less carbon, and fuel climate change more or less by the decisions about what we eat or what we buy and how we run our household and all that kind of stuff. So carbon footprint, water footprint similarly, right? So we're accustomed to thinking about this maybe a little more now in California about our water footprint. But for the church too, so what's the church's carbon footprint? Has that ever been, so is that something Ascension has ever done, or, thought about both, again, the running of the operation of the church, the lights, right? Here I am running this thing, it's taking fossil fuels, unless you're on all solar and all renewable, which you might be, I don't know, so, right, we're running fossil fuels to watch this little show. But all the way to things like, does everyone drive to get here, or does everyone walk or bike to get here? So what's the carbon footprint of the congregation, and it's, all that kind of stuff. So these are,
Get rid of that.
yeah. Yeah, so these are all,
Oh, they still,
don't you love that? So if we got little pop-up messages like that about ecological questions, we might think about this more often, right? If it popped into our screen on a more regular basis, I know, our little mental screen. So, and then at the same time, so this sort of dual problem, you could say. So on the one hand, we're destroying it all. On the other hand, we're so cut off from the life of the world on a literal biological level that we don't even maybe notice that we're destroying it all. We are able to live in this bubble of convenience and comfort and technology. And remote from the places, we'll see some slides later that show some of the real degradation. And from the lives of the poorest people on earth who are already feeling the effects of these things, we can sort of keep them at a distance and not sort of pay attention. So we're cut off from the beauty and needs and larger life of the world, and unaware often of the costs of our way of life, this great way of life, right? Is this the good life? Ethicists will ask this. Is this the good life? That's so depleting and so degrading to the rest of the world? Is that a good life? That cuts us off and keeps us addicted and stressed and, cranky and enraged or whatever, lonely. Is this the good life, or is there a better way to live in relation to the life of the world? So those are some of the bigger, big questions that you could spend, not just today, but your whole life, and people do. In fact, we need everyone spending their whole life looking at these questions. And because how are we going to turn the whole economy, this whole way of being human, without everyone's participation? So these are big, big questions. Because we are collectively alienated from reality in a meaningful sense, from the biological life of the world that sustains us, from the costs of the economy that drives us. We're disconnected from all of that, able to live in the illusion that everything's functioning okay, sort of, you know. To the extent that we are unaware of the fact that this whole way of life is unsustainable and will end, we're alienated from reality, from the necessity to turn and live in a new way. So,
Is that the frailty of mankind, that it started 10,000 years ago? And it's always been entropy, always declining, as you're saying?
well, yeah, good question. So hold that. I'm gonna be connecting it to the story of the fall in Genesis 3. But what does that refer to? Yeah, and you say 10,000 years ago, so the rise of agriculture,
Right.
many people name as the point when humans began to have this sense that we can kind of control things. We can decide what we wanna eat and when. By planting, people learned how to track life cycles of plants to plant, well, actually first domesticating animals, and but 10,000 years ago was plant agriculture, and coming to the sense that we can sort of be in control and determine harvest and wealth could be built, and writing and accounting could be invented, because now there were stockpiles of grain that had to be accounted for, so mathematics and then, or accounting, and then writing developed, and then civilization. So yeah, is that, and I find that a convincing hypothesis.
And spiritual beliefs started about then too.
Well, later, but yeah, as this alienation began, people began to make meaning out of that, and stories like Genesis 2 and 3 began to be told and eventually written down. So yeah, what has caused this alienation is a really important question. And how do we learn to live again in literal touch with the larger life of the world so that there can be a flourishing earth for future generations? It's a really scary question, really important question. And this biblical, so that's why we're going to look at biblical kind of stories about this to see how does this religious tradition name these problems. So yeah, climate chaos, which we're on the brink of. And I found this image, I don't know if you can tell what it is. Can you see what that is? It's an image of a town or something, and this tidal wave poised to, yeah.
It's not the Red
So-
Sea.
No, that's
Looks
right,
like it.
it's poised to crash, that's right. And fire burning, so I thought this was a great image, actually, of just so we're here living our little lives, driving around, doing our grocery shopping or whatever, and maybe we, know that, oh yeah, climate change, whatever. But the sense that it's looming and will consume our way of life is something we don't really have a visceral sense of for the most part, unless you live in other places in the world. And the Thomas Fire starts to, bring that home a little bit, or if you track how does drought relate to deforestation in the Amazon, that's a really terrifying question. And how does that relate to our beef industry, because they're grazing and they're raising food for those cattle from McDonald's in the Amazon being deforested, which blah, 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 blah. So there's all these interlocking questions about our whole way of life that create this mammoth kind of tsunami of risk and danger that awaits our human future. And how, can we learn a new way? We don't know that. We're not very good as humans at taking the long view and making really hard moves in advance of actual catastrophe. So until the wave crashes over us, will we be able to make change? That's not clear, but people are trying, in many countries working on this question. Can we reduce emissions drastically enough in time? Jury is out as to whether we're already past that point. If we stopped, burning fossil fuels tomorrow, would that be enough to avert the most catastrophic climate change? Possibly. But is it gonna happen tomorrow? Literally tomorrow? Not likely, unless an asteroid hits, right? And kills us all.
What would be what do you believe? Do you believe mankind's gonna save the world before it
I don't
happens?
know, right? I'm not one of the climate scientists, so some say no, we can't, it's too late. Others say no, we're still in a window where we can reduce drastically, but whether we can politically,
But what do
I
you
don't know.
believe inherently in your
I don't know, it doesn't look, it doesn't look,
That's an answer, right?
yeah, right,
Who
it
knows?
doesn't look hopeful, yeah. but I'm not a climate scientist to be able to say, yeah. So then climate change is one piece, but then there's and the first couple ones there are part of climate change, rising sea levels, changing and chaotic storm, rain, and weather patterns that messes up our capacity to grow food and have human civilization. Ocean acidification, which is a huge topic, and the bleaching and dying of coral reefs and ocean ecosystems, and plankton, which generate a large percentage of the oxygen in our atmosphere. It's from plankton, so when the ocean systems collapse, it isn't just tragic and beauty lost and all that, but also oxygen in the atmosphere. And also as we're deforesting, cutting down trees, so all this loss of plant life on Earth means there won't be enough oxygen in time. It's already starting to, I don't know. They say it's already starting to tip. Pollution and poisoning of water, air, soil bodies. Freshwater depletion, which includes pollution in the previous one. Deforestation, soil loss, which threatens both oxygen and rainfall. Forests are a key part of the rainfall cycles on Earth. So when they're gone, it leads to desertification. And soil loss, habitat destruction, extinctions. As you know, we're in the middle of the 6th great extinction. Large numbers of species being lost forever. Exacerbation of all of this among the most vulnerable humans, which is why Pope Francis in his encyclical, which is conveniently on the table right here, push the button, which you might know, On Care for Our Common Home, Laudato Si, it's a great book, yep. Wrote this in 2015 in advance of the Paris Climate Conference, which then was the first time the powers of the world came to a binding political decision. Binding only in the sense of mutual agreement. We don't have international enforcement capacity. So, you know, whether even Paris will result in enough change, we don't know, especially given US non-participation at this point on a national level. So yeah, exacerbation of effects among the most vulnerable humans. So I was going to say Pope Francis connects, just as Pastor Steve does, connects the life of the earth and the life of the poor as one problem, one reality. These are not two problems, these are one thing. This global economy that gives us the life we have is also trashing the poor, trashing the planet, literally. And these are interwoven problems with the economy. And then rising tides of climate refugees, increasing resource warfare, so water wars will be increasing this century, people predict, and other forms of resource warfare. In all of this, we are the privileged, right? We're the ones who can choose to notice this or not notice this, and keep on driving to the store for our groceries, which we don't care where they come from, and we're going to eat what we want, and all that kind of, because we can, right? Because we're the privileged. Also, because of our privilege, we're the ones who will feel these effects the last, because we can afford to buy bottled water if our fresh water is polluted, right? Not to say that the bottled water is any better, but we think it is. And we can buy our way out of a lot of these problems faster than those who are the poorest can, right? So there's a level of what ethicists call climate debt, climate responsibility, climate injustice built into this, that the poorest, who are the ones who've done nothing to cause these problems, they're not the ones whose, you know, Cadillacs and SUVs for the last how many years have been fueling this, but they're the ones suffering the effects, not us. So there's this great, grave ethical problem that we're the ones driving the problems, but we're the most buffered from feeling their effects. And other people are feeling them now and will. Who's going to die when there's a human die-off? Well, it's not going to be us first, right? It's going to be everyone else first. So we don't have to care, right? But that's an ethical problem. It's a spiritual problem. So all of this is this really difficult, hard, and unprecedented set of problems. The human species has not faced all of this threat to the future of life on Earth caused by us on a species-wide level before. So how do religious traditions make sense of this? Here's one. So Pope Francis in Laudato Si has this great line, "The earth, our home, is beginning to look like an immense pile of filth." It's one of the most haunting lines in the encyclical. And we don't see this because, again, we live in a place of privilege, so we can have parks and we outsource, the materials that go into our phones have to be mined somewhere, right? And the damage that, water pollution that it causes to make our phones and our this or whatever, our clothes, or, that's all, that's all happening somewhere else, so we don't see it. We just have a shiny new device, right? Or whatever. So we're not seeing this in our face all the time. But these are images, very ordinary images of many places on Earth. That's what Earth is beginning to look like. It's the cost of the industrial economy. And you can sort of see up there in the top right, I tried to find a picture with people in it, because it's important to know that these are places where people live, and that there are human costs already to, again, to this global economy. You can assume that there's people living down there in the upper left picture as well. Or that people used to live or would like to live in this seawater zone, or whatever that is, lake zone, or in those forests that are dead.
Is that a deforest?
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. It looks like there are images from Indonesia. I forget if that actually is, but there's a lot of deforestation going on in the rainforest in Indonesia, as well as the Amazon and Chile. And so, in no religion can this be interpreted as God's desire for creation in humans, right? I mean, I think that's really important to note, that this is not God's desire. The really fundamental point. No religion says, great, then God said, destroy it all. Like, that's not in Scripture. So how is it that, and hauntingly I said that quote from Pope Francis, the earth, our home, is beginning to look like an immense pile of filth. Also really haunting is the fact that Christians have been historically in charge of this global economy. We're the ones who created this. This is our vision of what the planet should look like. Christians, Europeans and then Americans, sort of developing.
Why do you say Christians? I think it's mankind.
Well, because many other kinds of humans have managed to live for tens, if not hundreds, tens of thousands of years without doing this. And Christians came along, and this is what happens. So today, it's true that China is not, run traditionally by Christians, and has its own contributions to this economy. So, it's possible that, but also traditional Chinese Confucian teachings would never permit this, and there are voices, even in the Chinese Communist Party, that are putting a brake on their development in the name of Confucian principles, so in a way that hasn't really happened yet on the Christian side, for complicated reasons. But yeah, so I mean, it's partly a human thing, but historically it is the case that it was Christians who thought this up and then exported it. Now China's getting in on the game too, whatever. So we have to take responsibility for our peace. And how is it that Christians can have done this, kind of, right? So, meanwhile, we're not paying attention. Even in church, we've managed to sort of not see all this kind of stuff. Not here necessarily, but in the world. So, this turn toward how could religion help then, right? So scientists agree we have the technology to make these changes really fast. Like they make the comparison to, we ramped up to World War II industrial war economy from a civilian economy really fast, like within months. A huge change in the US economy happened. We could do that again. We have the technology to move completely off fossil fuels. Now, that's only happened in the last few years as battery technology has improved. We're now at the point where they're saying we could do this immediately. What we lack is the vision, the will, the ethical framework, the profound desire or sense of call or vocation to actually do that.
It's only a few
Because
things.
why? Why should we, right? Why should we? Everything's fine, right? So this matter of building a shared vision, will, ethics, discernment, vocation is what religion is for, Christian and otherwise. And what Christian congregations, schools, leaders, laity are uniquely positioned to contribute. So how can we be part of the changing of human minds and hearts and wills and desire to make massive change before it's forced on us, and already to help intervene in the lives of those who are most vulnerable? Is this urgent ethical question, Christian question. So what kind of vision of Christianity would get us out of this kind of, which is a caricature, right? You know, it's all about kind of angels or only heaven or kind of the sky, right? Or human salvation only in sort of an interior sense only, which is very un-Lutheran, as you all know. Preaching to the choir, I know. And toward a bigger sense of what Christian life means, that's in literal, biological, incarnational connection with the life of the world and its future flourishing for the sake of future generations. That's this, or it's a Christian vision we lack as a whole, you know, world.
Lisa,
So,
it's interesting.
yeah,
Can you go back?
yeah.
So, I had a very intriguing conversation with my niece, who is a junior at Cal State Long Beach in environmental science.
Yeah,
So she's very passionate about this, and she hangs out with
yeah.
fellow environmental
Mhm.
students, and she lives with 3 other people. And they kind of have a vision, and they have an ethical framework, and they have a will and a desire.
Yeah.
But she said that people are still coming home with fast food, and for her, she's changed that, but it drives her nuts. And they're still driving places, and there's
Yeah.
still, like you mentioned, clones. And so we were talking for like 2 hours on Easter afternoon. But what she kind of came to, both of us, and we were talking about during the season of Lent as a church, we were talking about spiritual disciplines. Like,
Yeah.
I think people have a desire to be
Yeah.
spiritual, but they don't know how to practice it.
Yeah.
So we have these spiritual disciplines, and so my niece Katie was saying, like, we're learning all these things, and people really do have an ethical dilemma, and they really do have this desire, but our culture doesn't give a lot of places to practice it. And so even
Yeah.
the things that we buy or the cups that we use here, I watched Plastic Oceans, and I went to Goodwill and I bought tons. I'm like, I'm never using a plastic.
Yeah.
I have like forks with me. But how do we practice
Yeah.
it together?
Yeah.
So I think one of the things we most lack is actual hands-on tools to practice it together. And because so many of us, I grew up in a place where we were always growing food, but so many people don't really know how to do that.
Right.
And I feel like, oh my goodness, there's so much I don't know, and yet I grew up like eating locally.
Yeah.
Not because we ever thought about it, it's just because that's what my childhood was like. You just ate what you grew.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just
Yeah.
think we need more of hands-on
Right.
together
Yes.
and community
Yes.
support.
Yeah, that's right, which is what church is for, right?
Yeah.
Church is meant to be a community of living in the kingdom of God now. We experience what it means to say Jesus is Lord and how we are to live in that way that's different from how the world lives and all that kind of stuff we all know. So, right, if we had a vision, of a Christian vision that included the literal life of the earth, how would our churches be communities of completely alternative practice, right? Yeah. So I have the word community in there too, that's right, that's good. 4, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and it's all very good, so we know this, right? How much time, actually, I forgot to ask you this.
Okay,
When do
an
I need
hour?
to? An hour, okay.
9:30 to 10:30.
Okay, thank you. So, what if we lived as if we truly believed that God made all this and said that it was very good? This fundamental question, how would we live if we really believed that? Or how would your life change?
I always think of that movie, Soylent Green.
Story what?
Soylent Green.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking about that.
Yeah, so give a
All
little,
fog,
right,
pollution.
right, right. Yeah. Are we living in a way that manifests to the world how good, very good, God sees this whole creation as? Well, no, right? And then where do you see humans living out our created vocation in the image of this God, this Genesis 1 God, who does nothing but speak life and life and life and life and beauty and more beauty into the world, and it's all good and good and good and good and very good. And what does it mean? And then God creates us in the image of that God. That's the God in whose image we're created, the one who makes more and more beauty and abundance of life. That's what it means to be created in the image of God, because that's what we've just been seeing God doing, right? Up to that point. So where do you see humans living out what it means to be in the image of this Creator? What would it mean to live, in the image of God as we're created
I
to be?
think one of the maybe handicaps, at least for Protestants, is that, we were born out of kind of the second article. That's where
Yeah.
the need was in the 1500s,
Yeah.
was to get back to the
Yeah.
focus on salvation through Christ.
Yeah,
And I think we have ended up somewhat forgetting about the first article, and
Yeah.
we never really got onto the third. We were a little bit
Yeah.
afraid of it.
right.
So I think as we, teach the creed, or try to
Yeah.
live it out, we really need to get back to that
Right.
question about, all right, what does it mean to take the first article of God as
Yeah.
creator and
Yeah.
owns it all
Yeah.
seriously,
Yeah.
and then that the Spirit is at work today,
Yeah.
saying you can't just do things the way you used to.
Yeah.
Those are kind of the
This
bookends, I think,
resurrection
that could
life.
help us
That's right.
reform.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and as we'll see, we're gonna be doing a little Christology here too,
Okay.
so we don't have to leave behind the second article either,
We're
right?
kind of second
So-
article Jesus's, but we need to
Yeah.
get the whole thing.
Yeah, no, that's right, very good, yeah. So, what if we really grasped this Genesis 1 vision of what does it mean to be human, made in the image of a Creator who creates goodness and life and beauty into being, and my life is gonna do that too, that's what it means to be human. So that's, and then one more.
Could you tell us about the articles, because I'm not.
Oh, yeah, so he's referring to the fact that in the creed, it's
Creed, I
structured.
believe in God the Father Almighty,
Okay.
creator of heaven and
Yeah.
earth, that's first article,
Okay.
and in Jesus Christ, and in the Holy Spirit.
Right.
So those
The
three
persons
parts
of the
it.
Trinity.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So we forget the
Yeah.
third one.
The creed is structured according to the persons of the Trinity.
Right.
So, and then a Sabbath, so this whole Genesis 1 image of Sabbath as well. So Sabbath, as you know, we worship on the Christian Sabbath, but this image of Sabbath meaning the vision of reality as God intends it, and that we forget, and we live all week long as if, my demons are in charge of the world, or hate and rage, or fear and despair, or whatever is in charge of the world, and we come to worship and realize, oh no, Jesus is Lord, and we can live in this world that's ruled by love, and created by love, and that we're embraced by love, and saved by love, by grace, and we can live our lives in a whole different way, right, than vocation in the world, and then we're meant to live there. It isn't that you then leave and go back to reality, okay, now I gotta live in hate and fear again, right? No, the point is that we wanna live there, we're, empowered to live there all week long. Worship is meant, the walls of the sanctuary dissolve and we live in the sanctuary all week long, as it were, right? It isn't that we leave reality and go back to misery, but then we have one, no, it's an invitation into reality. And so too with Sabbath, the same idea for Jewish people, right? Same idea, the Sabbath is meant to be where we live all week long. We're invited into the goodness and beauty of God and the rest and the peace and the grace of God, and then we keep living there, that's the point. But inevitably we forget, and we need remembrance, anamnesis, not forgetting. We need to be reminded, do this in remembrance of me, right? We need to be reminded of who is Lord. So, again, how would our lives and our economy be different in a Sabbath perspective is a different lens, a different Genesis 1 lens into these questions, to live in reality, which is God's naming all of this as good and beautiful, as opposed to just something that we're supposed to trash and destroy. That's not the vision in Genesis. So there's this Genesis 1 vision, and then there's also a different creation story. So there's also, what does this mean for human vocation? The Luther question. There's also a Genesis 2 creation story, as you know, it's very different. And in this story, I have this image, Adamah, down here, and I have another quote from Pope Francis. We ourselves are dust of the earth, Adamah, Genesis 2:7, which means dust, soil, humus, Adamah, earth. That's the Hebrew word for dust, soil, earth, humus. From which Adam is made. You've studied this perhaps in Bible study, I don't know. Do you know that little pun in the Genesis 2 creation story? The word Adamah is what Adam, it comes from. Adam is not first a name of Adam, right? It's the word human being. Adam means human being. before sexual differentiation happens in the Hebrew, in the story. That doesn't happen, Ish and Isha, male and female, doesn't happen until Eve is created, then they become male and female, but Adam just means human being. And then it becomes the name, right, becomes a name, but it just means human being. So Adam from Adamah, just like you could say, so if our translations were conveying this connection, it would say, then God took earth and made an earthling, right? Or then God took humus and made a human. So we have the connection in the Latin, humus meaning soil, right? Not hummus, made from Vermont. God took hummus, no, humus. And humor and humility and all of that comes from the same Latin root. So being human of the humus, same thing as the Hebrew. So we're made from the soil, and we return to the soil. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. It's the same Adamah, right? You are earthling, made from earth. To earth you shall return. And so to live, and then in that story, of course, God puts the earthling in this beautiful paradise. And that's this story that may be part of the narration of kind of after agriculture develops, which becomes this life of toil and disconnection from the natural world, sort of perceived disconnection often in time. People kind of look back and say, gosh, it was kind of nice when we were living in more connection and harmony with the natural world. Tilling, harvesting, foraging, living at peace with the rest of the world, looking back at earth as paradise, experiencing earth as paradise. The whole earth, it isn't just a garden, it's the whole thing is paradise, this natural world, this beauty that God created, this whole thing is meant to be the paradise we live on. It was given to us as a paradise. In which we're meant to be a part, earthling from earth, we're not separate from. So Genesis 2 has this image of human creation in a flourishing, beautiful, natural world, and that we're meant to live there. We're meant to have our lives there in a good way. And then Genesis 3 narrates, well, then something happened, and we kind of had, we're not living in that garden anymore. Like, what happened? So the story sort of narrates this. I found different images of the image moving into an experience of agriculture as toil and of human life, and patriarchy arises, and disparities of wealth arise, and eventually empire and militarism and all this kind of stuff develop from the capacity through agriculture to hoard and stockpile resources, and not just as hunters and gatherers to be dependent on what the earth provides. So agriculture represents this big shift in how humans do kind of economy. And that's linked in Genesis 3 with the story of the fall out of paradise. So we've lost touch with this experience of being Adam, made from Adamah, made to image the Creator of Genesis 1 and 2. And this is a quote from contemporary ethicist Cynthia Molubita, who's at PLTS, the seminary in Berkeley, who writes, "We live in this world of beauty beyond comprehension, a glorious bit of earth and water, resplendent, shimmering, abundant life for all, and we face this moral crisis." So we're living in this Genesis 3 space of alienation, of disconnection. We are, in the words of John Cobb and Herman Daly, who are a theologian and an economist, living toward a dead end. It's a dead end. This economy is creating death. We're living toward a dead end. We're destroying Earth's life support systems and building this soul-shattering gap between the rich and the poor. Our numbers and our excessive consumption threaten Earth's capacity to keep on regenerating life. We're destroying Earth's capacity to keep regenerating life. We have become the uncreators, which is another one of these really haunting statements. So if God, in Genesis 1 and then 2, is all about creating life more and more and more, we're destroying them. Every extinction is wiping out part of God's imagination. What God has designed and given is destroyed. We are uncreating, we are unraveling the very means of life. We are making it impossible for life to continue on Earth by our industrial economy that gives us our great phones and our great, right? We are it's a shocking, horrifying diagnosis, and yet it's quite literally true. Literally true, yeah.
Do you think that as population maybe exponentially explodes and then our fossil fuels become much unavailable, that somewhere they collide.
Well, yeah, right, that's the unsustainability thing, that's right. There'll be an end to this way, right?
Yes,
And a lot of people are gonna die if we don't do it well.
and rolling back on all of our regulations
Yeah.
on pollution.
Which is
and
just a fancy
everything
word for
else.
protection, right? To call it
Yes.
regulation makes it sound negative, but it's really about
Exactly.
protection of the means of life itself. Should we destroy the means of life itself, or should we protect the means of life itself? Right. And you can call it regulation and say that's a bad thing, but what you're saying is, protecting the means of life, yeah. So, yeah, there's many forces that think protecting our wealth, whoever "our" is, a very small number of people are actually benefiting from this. And not even primarily first us, although we do too, but protecting that is more important than addressing these questions of the means of life on Earth. 2 hands I saw.
I have a quick
Yeah.
personal question. I noticed you have the watch sitting there watching your time,
Yeah.
which I don't usually see anymore. It's usually a phone.
Oh, yeah.
Do you not have a phone?
No, I have a phone, but
Okay.
I like the watch because it doesn't go blank and I can see it more readily.
Okay. I was like wondering, like, what do we do about our phones
I know, the
in
phones,
this world?
I know.
Yeah, so that's what I was wondering.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, I do have one. Unfortunately, I probably shouldn't,
I
but
didn't
I
want to
do.
sidetrack the profound point, but I did want to say that Cynthia is faculty at PLTS, CLU PLTS.
Yeah,
So that's,
Exactly. I
so-
said that, but it must have gone by fast, yeah.
you said that, I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. It went by fast, obviously. It needs to
And
be
then-
said again.
So when she comes to CLU,
Yeah.
let us know.
Oh, sure, yeah, okay. Yeah.
So haunting me through this whole thing that we've talked about so far is one of my students' comments. I teach 4th grade, and it's Earth Month in my
Yes.
classroom.
Good.
And,
Earth year.
yeah, I know,
No,
well,
Earth
and
season.
I
The whole Easter
have to
season
be
could be-
careful,
yeah.
but anyway.
No, that's good. I'm
Yeah.
I'm not-
And I nagged him about those water bottles, and most do not use them anymore.
Yes, very good.
But we were talking about the air quality,
Hmm.
and he says, yeah, but aren't we all just gonna aren't our bodies just gonna evolve to be able to adapt to the air quality? And I didn't even know what to say, and I wasn't gonna get into a debate with him, because it wasn't the time or whatever, and I said, whether that's true or not, do you really want your body to be able to adapt, to be able to breathe this poor quality of air? And so I thought, well, that's interesting that a 9-year-old,
Yeah. Is hearing
is
that at
thinking
home.
and hearing that somewhere.
Yeah,
And I thought, oh
yeah.
boy, but that's been playing in my,
You can tell, I mean, scientifically, evolution takes a long time.
well, that's what I'm thinking. I said, I think I probably did say something like this. I don't
Yeah.
think we'll all be around
No.
to experience that, or I
I think
can't
it's
really
possible
say
that right, the pollution kills and everything else kills all of us, like there might be survivors who have some adaptation that allows that, some mutation, right, that allows them to be the survivors,
Probably Norwegians.
but. Yeah, whoever went right might have some mutation, right, that it's good that everyone else should die
Yeah.
first, right, like, I mean, that's
Yeah.
probably not the best way to pin our hopes on,
Yeah,
right?
I just thought it was
Yeah.
very
It
interesting,
is
because
interesting.
usually,
Yeah.
That he's thinking about that.
yes, and usually children are very, I don't wanna, they really are so eager and
Yeah.
open about the earth and taking care of the earth, and,
Yeah.
and a lot of things they are, and
Just
he
doing it
is
somewhere.
Mr. Science, and I
Yeah.
thought that was great.
Yeah, yeah. So then just this little quick walkthrough, so, this earth god and the YHWH is the god in Genesis 2 with hands in the dirt and, right, molding, kept working to call us back. So then this great line, anyone know what story that's from? Pastor does. Both pastors are nodding their heads. Anybody else know what story that's from?
Yeah, the burning bush.
Yes, who said that? Yes, very good. Yes, which is in what book?
Was it Moses or Abraham?
Moses, that's right. What book of the Bible? I'm pushing you.
Oh,
What book of the Bible?
what part of the Bible?
Book, yeah, what book of the
What,
Bible?
what,
Do you know?
Exodus.
Exodus! Oh, A+ over here. Exodus, what chapter? What chapter?
Oh, gosh.
At least take a guess.
Exodus 3.
Three, oh,
Missed it by
here's
one.
this.
Good.
Did somebody say that?
She missed it by two.
She said 4, so she's only off by one.
Wow.
Great about
Yes.
that.
Yeah. So,
See,
oh,
so here,
it's
so
right there.
anybody know where this picture is taken?
She just put it up.
Can you see it? Is the light too much?
Where is it?
Can you tell? Yeah, that's what I'm asking. Anybody know?
Thousand Oaks.
Around here.
Thousand Oaks where?
You see on the hill?
No, good guess.
Yeah, I would
Good
guess.
guess. Who's
Failure
backyard?
Hill.
Where do you live?
It's at the end of.
Is it at
My
the,
back hill looks like.
Yeah.
is it Lang,
Failure Hill.
like the end of Arpolis? or-
No, it's not there. Yeah. So it's actually up in the Santa Monica Mountains on a trail that goes kind of the whole ridge line above Newbury Park, kind of.
Okay.
Oh, the
And it was like
Rosewood.
it was a long hike, and actually Hugh,
Lauren,
right, was on that hike, I'm pretty sure. This was last year when we had all that rain, and this hike had so many wildflowers. I could show you a whole, I mean, there's this paradise up there, right? From which we're mostly alienated, because we're so busy, right, and so we don't even notice. So God appears in this burning bush and says, take off your shoes, for this is holy ground, right? So this is holy ground. All of this is holy ground, is the larger contemplative invitation to perceive that we live on this holy ground, which this YHWH creator has given us. And then the whole Moses story unfolds from this. Both the self-revelation of God, this is where God's self-revelation as I am who I am is given, is in this story, right? Remember that? That's Moses says, who shall I say sent me? Because the other piece of the story is this call out of slavery and into the promised land flowing with milk and honey, this restoration to a way of being that's not marked by empire and wealth and enslavement and military power that Egypt represents, but into one's own land, one's own soil, and into a good and flowing and abundant life. So this image, this fundamental Jewish salvation story of being called out of slavery, which is the life we're in now, kind of, right? Marked by poverty and enslavement and militarism and empire, and into a restored promised land, into the same earth as promised land, and in touch with that abundance, milk and honey.
Do you have more thoughts on that milk and honey? Because you've been so good talking about separation. 'Cause I don't think people feel so separated from that. Like milk means like there's a baby, there's new life,
Yeah.
there's production. Honey, like
Yeah.
without the bees, we always be issues.
Exactly, yeah,
Do you
you're
think people are
doing
just
it.
so separated from that phrase that they don't even think
Oh,
about
what it means? Yeah, good thought, exactly. Right, which is why, like you were saying before, we need actual physical connection to the means of life to be able to understand biblical metaphors, to be able to be invited back into the life-giving connection with the larger world, yeah. To receive milk as miracle, meant for a baby, not just a commodity, this commodification of everything, to receive earth as holy ground. And its gifts as holy gifts, that we're part of this whole fabric of life, and it's all a sacrament, yeah. And that has something to do with this call out of slavery and into this promised land. It's all the same story, right? That begins here, YHWH appearing to Moses, and the whole thing opens up from there. So living in the promised land as the Jewish sort of core salvation narrative, and then in the Christian narrative, coming all the way into creation, becoming animal, God becoming animal to find us. So then this whole Christological connection that I promised Howie before. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved over the face of the waters, and God said, let there be light. So, and then, where is this passage echoing this? Where's that passage from?
Where's,
John 1.
John 1. yeah.
Very good. So in the beginning again, right? Same words. In the beginning was the Word, and God said, let there be light. In the beginning was the Word that spoke it all into being, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. all things came into being through this word, without whom not one thing came into being. So it's all spoken by this word of God. All of this life is this Jesus, right? So we don't have a very Johannine, you could say it differently, Lutherans, even though Luther loved John, but we don't, as a whole, have this big, expansive Johannine Christological sense of the second article that pulls it all together. It's a very narrow often, yeah. So it's not that we have to, and then the word becomes flesh, which means matter, right? Meat, animal. The word meat, in Spanish, carne, at the root of incarnation, the word of God and sarx in the Greek is the same thing. It means flesh, it means meat. So God becoming flesh, tissue, material, creation, incarnate, and dwelt among us. So the patterning, the word, the logic, the order, the wisdom, the elegance, the intelligence that made it all, the DNA of all of the universe, the pattern of it all becoming flesh and dwelling among us, the incarnation, bringing this fullness of God into flesh. So again, very material, very biological, even though we don't necessarily read it that way. And this word is life in John 1. The resurrection and the life, John 11, what story is that? Biblical scholars, resurrection and the life, where does Jesus say that? What story? Anybody know? We heard it in, we hear it in Lent, right? Lent 5 in year 8, the story of the raising of Lazarus. And what is the entire mission of God in flesh but that they might have life and have it abundantly? So this abundance of life, it's all in line with Genesis 1. So John 1, Genesis 1. John 10, and the fullness of life that God does, that God speaks and is meant, that's what the mission of God is, that there might be more and more and more life. Not less and less, like we're creating, but abundance of life. And so then, to bring it back into Easter, we're invited back to the garden. So in John 20, which we just heard last week, right? Easter gospel, the way to paradise is open once more. The ancient curse lifted, Genesis 3, invited back into the garden. The gardener himself meets us and calls us. So what's the reference in John 20, the gardener? The gardener in John 20 is who?
Jesus.
Yeah, yeah, the risen Christ, that's right.
Right.
And Mary's in the garden,
Right.
and she sees him, and she's not quite sure who he is, and thinks maybe he's the gardener. And then he calls her name, and she sees him. And so it's an intense, John is full of symbolism, right? So it's this intentional connection back to the original garden. So John is connecting to Genesis 1 throughout, but also to Genesis 2. And again, it's all about restoration of this original goodness, of this original blessing of life. And that Jesus, the gardener, is inviting us back into this human vocation of living in harmony in this world that is a paradise. So we're invited by our human vocation to live in reality. Reality is this earth is paradise. That's the reality God made. We've created this alienation that threatens all of life in some way or another. But we're being invited, Easter invites us to live back in reality. So what would that look like? It's the same question as Genesis 1 in a sense. So tending all earth as the garden of God, as the human vocation. So I've just found different images. The one, I don't know if you can read, Presiding Bishop Elizabeth Eaton, in 2016, we were called as a church to support the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, so naming this connection to indigenous protection of earth, as well as to the necessity of political advocacy, so that little image is meant to suggest both pieces, that we need to be politically active in real life in opposing fossil fuel industries that continue to pump and destroy as through pipelines and explosions and all the catastrophic events that come with fossil fuel production, and then they burn it and it contributes to climate change. Like the whole thing is morally corrupt. We need to resist the increasing fossil fuelization, infrastructure. That's one piece, as the Standing Rock Sioux are doing to protect their water. Water matters more. Green Building Council, that's about learning to create buildings and infrastructure that is green and sustainable. So each of these is showing different pieces, the connection to the global south and the life of all humans, not just white rich people, etc. And then I just wanted to have a couple slides on also this sort of contemplative sense of learning to see again the larger world, the word alive in all that is, the word that created it all, right? That is also God's own imagination, to learn to read again the larger natural world as book of nature, revealing God, the author of nature. So ancient Christians had this sense that the natural world is God's book of nature, book of scripture, and that we can learn to read the heart of God, the imagination of God by contemplative presence to the larger natural world. That it's full of God, it reveals God. After all, who made up that fox, right? Who invented this coral reef? And that we gain a loving, beautiful, and more than human connection to who God is through presence to the natural world when we are in touch with it. So that, it isn't just about what kind of car you drive, but also this larger learning to see the world again and love the world again, right? Because we won't protect what we don't love. And we don't love what we don't know well. So there's a moral imperative as well. And the top left picture is from that same hike. So this is right up the road, right? All this beauty is right here. And we're invited to live in it and to let our own homes and lives be part of the larger beauty of God as well, which is just a more fun way to live, right?
So who invented oil and for what
Yeah.
purpose?
I know, for what purpose, right? So maybe there's purposes of oil that future generations won't have access to because we burned it all in stupid ways, right? Like we don't obviously know the purpose of oil because we're using it to cause destruction. That can't be God's intention, right? If you believe in the God of Genesis 1, that's not the intention of oil. That's not it. We don't know yet what it is. And
Fire.
You're right.
Fire.
Yeah, who knows? We haven't found clearly by our use of it, we're showing that we don't know what the proper use of oil is. That's right, good question. How then shall we live? So we're Easter people. Grace means we can live in a new way. The resurrection means we can live in a new way. We don't have to keep living in ways that are destroying it all. So how? Right? So I just put up some images. All of these are whole topics, like what would it mean for you to become carbon neutral? We gotta all stop with the emission thing. We gotta stop, today. What does that mean for you? Are you gonna stop fueling your life with fossil fuels? The congregation, how are you gonna stop? Together, right? The upper left is the agriculture thing, so Pastor Chaman mentioned growing up in a local food economy. And agriculture is actually one of the biggest drivers of climate change there is. A big part of it is red meat. If we all eliminated red meat immediately, it would make a massive change in our agricultural patterns on Earth. It's driving a huge amount of deforestation and fossil fuel use, as well as methane, as well as just being bad for you, they say. That's a big, big, big step. Cut out all red meat. But the upper left is a whole bunch of other things as well, of holding on to biodiversity and not chopping it all down to have land, of farming in intelligent ways instead of unintelligent ways, of incorporating forests into agriculture.
Could you read those to us?
Yeah. Yeah, so ecological restoration, that means cleaning up and restoring places we've destroyed. Resilient urban planning and design means how are we going to do cities in a way that isn't a net drain on the larger ecosystem and watershed. So how can we conserve water and retain stormwater and reuse water and all, et cetera, and design with like green roofs and green walls and solar and have cities that work. Carbon farming and ranching means how can we return to forms of farming and ranching that sequester carbon, so traditional prairie agriculture, or not, ecosystem, sequesters carbon with long 12-foot roots and perennial plants that don't have to be dug up all the time, and so can we return to prairie-style either grain agriculture, people are working on that at the Land Institute in Kansas, and or bison instead of cattle, because bison sustain the prairie as opposed to just eating it all the way down to the ground and destroying it like cattle do. So that's what carbon farming and ranching, so methods of farming and ranching that don't destroy the world. Organic farming, you probably know what that refers to, not using pesticides, synthetic pesticides and herbicides. Permaculture means forms of land use that are permanent, perennial, as opposed to reliance on agriculture and tilling again, which results in soil loss and soil degradation. So permanent, perennial, but also design that works within the bioregion that you live in. So permaculture, garden or yard or whatever here would look very different from Columbus, Ohio, where I taught at the seminary before I moved here, because they get a lot more rain than we do. So permaculture that works in a given place without needing a lot of human input, that's perennial, that's sustainably producing food and food and cover for wildlife. Forest gardening is the thing I mentioned, where can we do agriculture in a way that works within tree cover, like coffee that's grown in the shade, is an example some people have heard of. Although, why are we importing, do we need this coffee, can we do that in a way that doesn't use fossil fuels? No. So forest gardening, there are a lot of versions of agroecology, that's called. My cousin's daughter is actually just finishing her master's in Wales in agroecology, and has an interest in returning to Africa where she grew up to work on that, but we need it everywhere. Not chopping down trees in order to have agriculture, let's do both, right? Native plant gardening, that means what many of you are probably doing in your yards because they're encouraging us to save water, to plant natives. So it has to do with rewilding the landscape and providing food for insects, native insects and birds and other animals, right? With native plants, so that it's part of a larger bioregion as opposed to these little human areas with plants that don't belong there, that don't feed the local animals and insects. Agroecology and agroforestry, I don't know why that's different from forest gardening. Maybe there's a distinction. Landscape architecture and design means let's do this intelligently, landscape management. So these are all different ways of thinking about how we do our human use of earth in order to have food, which again is the major contributor to climate change. But transportation's a good one too. And the farmland to forest is again about can we and not forest in places where forest can grow where there's enough rain, but in places where it won't, like prairies, like in much of the US, then restoring prairie as our agricultural form, as opposed to the monoculture thing with combines and fossil fuels and chemicals and all of that, that's feeding animals, right? What percentage of the farmland in the US and around the world is feeding, not humans, but cows? It's gigantic, and soil loss and water pollution and fossil fuels going into that. So again, the meat thing is a big deal. Where our local, anybody know actually? There's a local meat producer in Ventura County that produces sustainable meat. So you can do it, it's just more expensive and hard, you have to look for it. To eat meat that is actually sustainably grown is possible.
I always have I have this quiz that I have my students do and talk about living in rhythm to the Christian year.
Yeah.
And that it's a true or false. Meat should be eaten in season.
Mm-hmm.
And they all, I mean, every year they look at me like, trick question,
Yeah.
false. Almost,
Yeah.
or then they're like, what does she mean? It must be
Yeah.
true. It's so weird.
Yeah.
But, I mean, there is something seasonally if you're a rancher.
Yeah.
But to me, the biggest season is, I think of Luke and the prodigal son. The prodigal son comes home, and that's when they kill the fatted calf.
Yeah.
Which means that if it's a big deal to kill the fatted
Yeah.
calf, they're not eating McDonald's
Yeah.
every day.
Right.
And
Right.
your Big Mac.
Right.
And so if the red meat was looking at a
Yeah.
celebration that happens so
Rarely,
rarely,
right? Then you could
how
afford
different
the
it would be.
sustainable, the
Yeah.
sustainably grown thing, because it's a big deal, it's a special occasion, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, great connection, yeah. And
So where is
proposing,
this sustainable?
Wait, where is it in Ventura?
oh, Watkins Ranch, Watkins something, I think Watkins Ranch. It's near Ojai.
Is it, or are they just red meat?
It's red meat, pork, I think, as well. Eggs are easy, eggs and poultry are easier. You get, like, farmers markets have sustainably grown eggs and poultry, but what's harder is beef and pork. Yeah, that Watkins is the only one I know
I'd like to get that kind of a earth ball for my grandkids, so we can talk a little bit about this. Where did you
Yeah,
get that?
I don't know, because that's Pastor
There's the
Steve's.
website on the bottom of the globe.
Oh, okay, earth, thank you.
Yeah.
Earth
I will read it to you.
Thank you.
Cool.
I like that.
Speaking of chickens, one of the things that the Bean family did research on, and their members here, is in our new garden area with the capital campaign,
Amazon.
is what if there were some families, and we actually got some paperwork from the city and that, but do a chicken co-op here on site. So those families that are caring for the chickens could have fresh eggs, and maybe we would sell some fresh eggs on Sunday mornings out at the garden. And then, you know, if they were using some for science or something at school here, they could save a certain amount. But then there's families that are here with the chickens, so that was
then
one
when
of the
you
thoughts.
Have chicken that you've raised and you know its name, that chicken has a, right, means something very different.
It does, it does. And we don't eat our chicken, we just have laying hens at our own house.
But if it dies, you might eat it. I mean, like, but you
Yeah.
would know that chicken, right?
Absolutely.
It's not a commodity on a piece of
Yeah.
styrofoam that's grown in some kind of horrific animal torture system, really. I mean, you don't even wanna know where your food comes from, meat and dairy. And eggs. It's shocking, it'll blow your brain open, and you probably should know, because it's so awful. And we need to be, returning to a much more human and sacramental sense of food as this
Yeah.
miracle. Yeah, especially animals. Oh my gosh. Yeah, to eat an animal.
Do you have more slides?
I think my last slide is just this prayer. From St. Basil from the 6th century, and he is riffing on Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and so he prays this. O God, enlarge within us the sense of communion with all living things, our siblings, the animals to whom thou hast given the earth as their home in common with us. We remember with shame that in the past we have exercised our high human dominion with ruthless cruelty. This was in the 6th century. So that the voice of the earth, which should have gone up to thee in song, has been a groan of travail. May we realize that they live not for us alone, but for themselves and for thee, and that they love the sweetness of life.
I love the fact that
Yeah.
between, all living things, comma,
Yeah.
our siblings, not a comma.
Yeah.
Our siblings, the
No.
animals.
Yeah, you're right. Amen.